Molly here. Today we are discussing Star Trek Discovery Season 5, Episode 6, Whistle Speak. The episode opens with Michael Burnham, Tilly, and Stamets trying to figure out the clue from the vial of water that was found on the ISS Enterprise in the previous episode. They're running every test they can think of, but the vial appears to contain nothing more than distilled water. Michael Burnham taps her badge twice and ends up in the Infinity Room with Dr. Kovich, the old guy with the big glasses, in the White Room. Michael Burnham wants to go search for Malin Locke, but Kovich tells her that's not Discovery's mission. Their mission is to figure out the clue and find the progenitor's tech. Michael Burnham admits they aren't having any luck figuring out the clue, and Kovich gives her a list of the scientists who hid the progenitor's tech. He gives her this list on a yellow sheet of paper from a genuine 21st century legal pad, not replicated. Michael Burnham asks him where he got it, and Kovich just tells her that he's resourceful. In the next scene, Dr. Culber is interacting with a hologram of his abuela. It is a grief alleviation therapeutic based on brainwave patterning, and the hollow of his grandmother is exactly as he remembers her. He tells her he experienced something on Trill where his body was inhabited by another, and since then, he's had a feeling that's hard to describe. He asks her if she can help him understand it. He gets irritated when she says no, and he tells the computer to check the database, because she should be able to answer that. They spoke often of her spiritual feelings and practices. The hologram grandma then tells him she also trained him to be a doctor, a man of science, and asks him how he can consider the soul when he hasn't yet examined the body. Meanwhile, Michael Burnham, Tilly, and Stamets are crossing the names off of Kovich's piece of paper and narrowing it down to a Dr. Creel. His specialty was weather-generating towers to make it rain. They then narrow the location down to a planet called Halemno. They mushroom jump to the planet. There is one functioning weather tower, and it's disguised as a mountain. The people are pre-warp and pre-industrial. A nervous Ensign Adira Tal postulates that the tower was a humanitarian mission because the planet would otherwise be uninhabitable, and the tower was disguised as a mountain so as not to violate the Prime Directive. Of course, there's an unusual energy field around the tower, so they can't just beam in and out to get the clue. Michael Burnham decides that she and Tilly will go down to the surface and figure out how to get in. The people of this planet have a phonetic language of regular speech and words, but they also have a whistle component to their language, and that's used to communicate over long distances. Michael Burnham tells Tilly that you can learn a lot about a society by the way individuals speak to one another. Then comes a data dump thrown in to educate the audience. Lots of telling and not showing here. I guess they couldn't find a way to work this information into the story naturally, so Michael Burnham just gives us a monologue. So the society doesn't have any terms denoting social status or class. They have 3 gender identities, and they prize connection with one another despite the hardships they face. And this was like, tell me you're pandering to Gen Z without telling me you're pandering to Gen Z. This species also has multiple words for pain, injury, hurt, and dust. When Michael Burnham gets done showing off her knowledge in xenoanthropology, Tilly tells her that they could really use her at Starfleet Academy. Michael Burnham replies, "Don't tempt me," then asks Tilly how things are going there. But before Tilly can respond, Raynor interrupts to tell Michael Burnham they've loaded subcutaneous comms into the transport system, and they now have a retinal tricorder mod. Michael Burnham and Tilly beam down to the planet. They activate their retinal tricorders, and Michael Burnham asks Tilly about the Academy. One of Tilly's students is thinking about leaving the Academy to take a position on a cargo vessel and asked Tilly for advice. Tilly tells Michael Burnham this isn't the first cadet to want to leave because the Academy isn't giving the students what they need. The conversation is interrupted by whistle speak. For some lucky reason, for the writers, Michael Burnham and Tilly have happened to come to the planet when a bunch of people will be making a pilgrimage to the summit of the mountain/tower. These people have no idea that the mountain is technology. They think their gods are responsible for this tower and making it rain. Michael Burnham and Tilly encounter a pilgrim that is about to die from dust in her lungs. The people then use vibration bowls to clean the dust from her lungs, which causes Michael Burnham to pass out. After Michael Burnham awakes, she's told there's a race to see who gets to go into the tower and meet the gods. The race begins with eating some cube that makes the participants very thirsty, but you're not allowed to drink. If you drink, you're out of the race. They're running this race, and Michael Burnham notices some moss mutations, which lead her to a malfunctioning control panel for Rain Mountain. She quits the race and goes and fixes the panel. Tilly stays in the race, and it's down to her and the child of the keeper of the tower. The end of the race requires them to carry a bowl of water with them, but not drink. The other runner spills their bowl, so Tilly pours some of her water into their bowl, and they complete the race together. As it turns out, the winning of the race actually means getting sacrificed to the gods to make it rain. Of course, there's something in the walls preventing the transporter from getting to Tilly. As Tilly is waiting to meet God, she notices a number on the wall that matches a symbol on the vial clue. She realizes she's about to meet God in Tower 3, but the next clue is in Tower 5. Violating the Prime Directive, Michael Burnham convinces the Tower Keeper that their rain temple is alien technology, and his child, who's in with Tilly, doesn't have to be sacrificed for the crops, that the rain will come anyway. He eventually believes her, and he unlocks the room where Tilly and his child were about to meet God. Tilly and the other person survive. It still rains. Michael Burnham explains to the Tower Keeper that he will have to maintain the technology or the tower will fail like the other 4 towers, and everyone on the planet would then die. The Tower Keeper now has to figure out how to convince his people that sacrifices are no longer needed. Off-screen, Michael Burnham retrieves the clue from Tower 5, so now they have to figure out the next clue. Also in this episode, Raynor builds up Adira Tal's confidence to combat the incompetence they feel from bringing the time bug on board. Dr. Culber finally talks to his partner about his feelings, sort of. Culber asks Stamets to help him do a brain scan to look for residual effects of sharing his body with Janal. Stamets asks Culber if he's having residual symptoms, and Culber downplays what should have been an emphatic yes. Shame on Dr. Culber, because Stamets directly asked him if he was okay, and Culber wasn't honest with him. If their marriage or whatever they choose to call it suffers from this, it's Culber's fault because he chose not to openly talk with his partner. Anyway, the scan on Culber's brain comes back clear. Stamets actually says to Culber, "There's something you're not saying." Culber admits he was hoping the scans would give him an answer. He was looking for a physical reason for what he's feeling, so he could understand and talk about it. He tells Stamets that ever since Trill, he's felt more connected and more attuned to something greater than himself, greater than all of them. But if there's no scientific reason for it, then he trails off. Stamets then asks him if it's a spiritual thing. Culber nods. Stamets tells Culber what matters most is that Culber is okay, and tells him the human brain is complex, and he should just enjoy it. Dr. Culber goes and finds Book, and tells him he's having a spiritual awakening, or maybe he's just seeing a truth he's always known. Ever since his experience on Trill, nothing else explains it. Book tells Culber that it sounds kind of wonderful. Culber tells Book that he told Paul, Stamets, but he doesn't think he really understood, and he doesn't know that Stamets ever will. Book says, "So?" Culber replies, "He's my partner," and Book tells him that humans have a tendency to consider something less meaningful if it's just for themselves. Then he says he remembers Michael Burnham dealing with it, even though deep down, that feeling of being alone was the oldest and closest friend she ever had, but that's what made him love her. Then Culber says, "You miss her," and asks Book if he thinks he and Michael Burnham can get back what they had. Book responds, "One answer at a time, Doc." At the end of the episode, Michael Burnham and Tilly put the next piece into the map and tell us the inscription on the clue is in Betazoid, and they're working to figure it out. Tilly asks Michael Burnham what she thinks Dr. Creel was trying to tell them, because every clue comes with a lesson. They decide that the real message is probably that technology is a massive responsibility, and they need to be careful when they find the progenitor's tech. Tilly and Michael Burnham are interrupted by the bridge saying Mal and Locke have been located, and the Discovery is to jump there immediately. The end. Okay, this episode. Well, there are so many things to unpack with this. I guess I'll just start with what I think is probably the most important thing to say about this episode. Actually, two of the most important things, which for me are kind of the same thing. First of all, when Dr. Culber is looking for a physiological reason for what he's feeling and doesn't find it, they pretty much imply that the opposite of the physical is spiritual. I am of the opinion that the opposite of the physical isn't necessarily the opposite here, but if it's not physical and you're experiencing symptoms, the next thing to look at is the psychological, not the spiritual. It's ridiculous. In this episode, there were two conflicting messages there. You have these primitive screwheads who are sacrificing people to the volcano gods to make it rain. Clearly, there are no gods. This is alien technology that they are perceiving as God. And they're killing people to keep it going, or so they think. So there's one message. And then in the same episode, the other message is that Dr. Culber is having this spiritual awakening because he's having all of these feelings that have been awakened by his experience on Trill. And the reality is that's psychological, that's emotional, that's not spiritual. So why they have these two conflicting messages in the same episode? There were two different writers on this episode, and obviously yet above them are the showrunners. So somebody has put a bunch of messages in this and they don't mesh well. Probably can tell that I didn't really care for this episode just based on that crap alone. The other thing is this bizarre need that they seem to have to be connected to something larger than themselves. I guess one thing that I've learned in life is that one of the most important things is that every person needs to learn how to be okay by themselves alone. Because if you aren't okay on your own, within yourself, if you can't just be by yourself and be at peace, then there's something wrong inside of you. You shouldn't be going out there trying to find that in other people. So those were the two biggest things that really pissed me off about this episode. There's more I'll get into, but I will let the old man take over. I know he has some definite things to say about this as well.
This episode reminded me of last season for Strange New Worlds. There was an episode called Lost in Translation, and the episode itself on the surface seemed like it was a decent episode until as we watched it, it seemed like they borrowed heavily from Doctor Who's 42. And then once one picked up on that, it took away from the pieces of the episode that were actually interesting because I already saw the interesting pieces in Doctor Who 42. This episode, you could argue, came from a few different places, but the two places that it seems like when they ran their AI program to give them an outline of a story, the two pieces that the AI drew most from was a TNG episode called Who Watches the Watchers from Season 3, Episode 4, and then a Stargate Atlantis episode from the first season, Episode 6, Childhood's End. And when one realizes that that's where the majority of this episode came from, it's difficult to rewatch this episode without seeing how they borrowed from those two other pieces of work. The other story with Culber and him trying to find what spiritually was awakened in him, I agree, Molly. I do think there's importance in life for friendship and for forming bonds with people, but if you can't be comfortable with who you are by yourself, how can you share your life with other people? Because you don't know who you are. You're needing to latch on to other people to find meaning in your life. At least in my opinion, you shouldn't be doing that. You either are damaged or you just haven't grown up yet, because that's part of growing up. I was talking to Molly after the episode, and the Dr. Culber story with after that joining, and then he's having these problems. What I thought would be a more interesting storyline than what they're doing is, remember, Dr. Culber is dead, and this is a mushroom clone of him. This is from Season 1. So what I thought would make a more interesting story is when the mushroom people cloned Dr. Culber, if they never factored in this whole joining process that could happen. So after the joining, I was kind of thinking that a better story would be, and that caused some sort of cascade problem with the mushroom clone because it was never designed to do such a thing. And so what he was trying to seek out is, there's something wrong here, was that him coming to realize that he's actually not Dr. Culber, he's Mushroom Guy, but they're not going to do that.
He wants to return to the mushroom patch.
Well, maybe, and I think that would be, as stupid as when they did that, at least it would be consistent with the mythos that they set up in season 1. So I think that would make a better story than this larger, I'm trying to find God or something thing that he's going through.
I'm trying to remember, because it was a long time ago, because they, for some reason, can't get seasons out on a yearly basis anymore. But I'm trying to remember, after he came back from the mushroom patch, this mushroom version of Dr. Culber, what kind of crisis of identity did he have?
I think there was at least one episode right afterwards where there was a question about that. But I'd have to go back and look. I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head anything major being covered.
I think part what they're trying to do in this last season, it kind of feels like with some of these characters, they're trying to go back and fix huge mistakes that were made in the writing in earlier seasons. Because we've had them go back and try to rewrite Michael Burnham's history. They're trying to flesh out Dr. Culber's emotional state at this point. We're actually seeing a little bit more of some of these bridge people, like using their names and things like that, which, again, this is not something that they were really good at in the previous seasons. So I get the feeling that they're trying to fix things. However, again, it's too little too late. And with a lot of this, they need to understand that you can't go back and rewrite history. Not when this is a television show and there's basically video evidence of everything that they've done before. With YouTube, people can easily just make videos comparing what they did before and what they've done now and just be like, look, we know this isn't the same.
And the problem with Dr. Culber and his mushroom clone, and it's actually with all of these series. So remember, Gray is a robot. So that's not the same person that we met before Gray died.
Well, we never met Gray before Gray died. We met Adira after Gray died, and then we saw the flashback of Gray dying. So, again, they seem to think that you can just put somebody's brainwaves into a, well, for lack of a better word, a robot or a mushroom man. I guess we're supposed to believe that's the same person.
And the same issue with Picard. At the end of season 1, Picard died, and they put him in a robot. And nobody really bothered to think, is that Jean-Luc Picard anymore? Or is that Gray? Or is that Dr. Culber? So the concept of self in this show, or if you want to go religious like they're going, the concept of soul, and did you transfer their soul into this thing? I don't understand what they're doing. They're trying to do this dime store philosophy that we called it out last week as well. And I don't think they thought this through because I don't think they have these answers. I don't think this is leading anywhere that's going to come to some large revelation. I think they're going to pull some major bullcrap out of their butt at the end. But they're wrestling with concepts that might make good episodes, but they never deal with it. They never deal with Picard being dead, and then he's got this son, and then that's not really his dad, so you think his son would be like, I wish I would have gotten to know my dad, and at least the robot could have said, well, I'm not your dad, but I'm a good facsimile. Maybe I can give you a little bit, kind of like when a friend tells you a story about an old relative. And Dr. Culber, being this mushroom clone, you think they could do something with that. You think Paul would say something like, you know, you've never been the same since that mushroom patch. What's going on here? And then coming to the realization that Dr. Culber's not Dr. Culber. He's some alien reproduction of Dr. Culber.
Yeah, I know a lot of people didn't watch DC's Swamp Thing. It was a one-season series. 4 years ago now, something like that. In that series, spoiler alert, if you haven't watched it and you don't want this spoiled, stop listening for like the next minute. I'll put markers in the file so that you can skip over this section if you want to. But in the series, we find out that the creature, the swamp thing, he isn't actually a mutated version of the scientist that fell into the swamp. He actually is a creature that the plants made. He's made of plant material. And he has a crisis as to who he is, because he has all of the memories of the scientist, all the feelings that he had. But the scientist's body is found in the swamp, and Swamp Thing, he is made of plants. So he's trying to figure out who is he, because he has all of these memories. They're not really his, because he is not the scientist. He is this creature that was just created. And there is a real crisis of identity there that he has to deal with. I just feel like they could have done this so much better in New Trek with all of these people being transferred into robot bodies. You know, another show that did it was better. Again, spoiler alert, so I'm going to put this in the spoilers, skip over. But in Venture Brothers, it turns out that Dr. Venture's sons, including, and even Dr. Venture himself, they're all clones, because it's based on like a Johnny Quest. And in this show, Johnny, the kids, they're going with their dad on all these adventures, and sometimes the kids die. So what happened was, Dr. Venture, he had a clone farm, and he cloned his sons. Eventually, one of the sons finds out that, yes, they are clones, and this has happened repeatedly. And he does have a crisis of identity, because he finds out he's not the original Dean. He struggles with this, and then finally he tells his brother, Hank, that they're clones, and Hank, he takes it in stride because he's a different person. And to him, he feels like the luckiest kid on Earth because he died all of those times and yet he's still there. So he just absorbed all of those other experiences from the previous Hanks into himself. He's still Hank, whereas Dean struggled with it. And again, there's a way that you could have explored these things with the robots and the Mushroom Man in Star Trek Discovery and in Picard, but they've failed to do so. And I hate to use the word soul. I'm not going to talk about my own spiritual beliefs here, but I just have to say that I wish they would have explored their ideas as far as transferring someone's thought patterns into a machine or a mushroom, and what the ramifications of that really are. Because clearly, physically, that is not the same person. So then it has to come down to, I guess, what a lot of people would consider to be a soul. They have not explored that even in the least, which is very disappointing.
In the original series, they had that Nurse Chapel story, the title of the episode, What Are Little Girls Made Of? This had to do with her ex-fiancé that died and was recreated as a robot, and then you didn't really find that out till toward the end of the episode, and then at the end of the episode, I forget how the conversation went exactly, but it was something like, well, he was never there to begin with. Like, they were basically acknowledging that that robot that had the memories of her fiancé, that there was something missing in the transfer. There was some, again, soul piece that was missing. It was a reproduction of memories, but not of ethics, not of things that actually make you who you are. And that was back in TOS. So we've taken a side tangent on this topic because they introduced the Dr. Culber story, which to me was the only unique piece of this episode that's really worth spending any time on, because the other part of the episode was a combination of those two episodes, and we'll go into that in a few minutes here to just kind of briefly just brush the beginnings of where they stole from. If you don't know where it was taken from, you just kind of, I think, look at the episode and go, hey, this wasn't so bad. They were trying to do something Star Trek-y. And it's like, yeah, they tried to do something Star Trek-y because they took from a TNG episode and a Stargate Atlantis episode. That's why it seemed like it was a Star Trek-y thing. And I don't know what this series is doing at the end here. I don't understand at all what's going on. This is dime store philosophy. This is 2024. People are more sophisticated when it comes to, if you're going to do original material and do a twist on it, you have to make the twist matter. If you're just going to do a story and just change a couple of pieces and hope nobody notices, I don't know why you think nobody's going to notice. Because most of this episode came from that TNG episode, Who Watches the Watchers? That's the episode where there was this primitive society that the Federation had some anthropologists there that were hidden in a duck blind, and they were observing the culture. But then the duck blind failed, and then all sorts of Prime Directive stuff came from that, including they thought that Picard was a god. And so they kind of flipped that 180 in this episode, where Michael Burnham wasn't really worshipped as a god, but she was saying that just because we exist doesn't mean your gods don't exist. But the story itself was extremely similar. In fact, after we watched this Discovery episode, we went back and watched the TNG Who Watches the Watchers episode, and it was a far superior story.
Yes, it was.
And then the Stargate Atlantis episode, Childhood's End, what this had to do is this was a group of children up until 24 years old, I guess up to 25 years old, technically, in a forest on this planet, and they thought that they had to do sacrifices when a person turned 25 because that kept the Wraith away, and the Wraith were the bad guys in this series. And what it turned out to be was a piece of equipment basically caused some sort of dampening field to happen where technology wouldn't work, and it was the thing protecting the village, or set of villages, actually. They stayed within the radius of this protective field. Rodney, as he was trying to steal the power source, he disabled the equipment, and then the Wraith were starting to come back, and then Rodney had to quickly fix that device to get it working again. That just reminded me of those rain devices that they had set up, and Michael Burnham having to fix them, and then they were in that forest, and then there was that perceived sacrifice that had to happen to keep things working. So you combine these two episodes and you have like 80%, maybe even 90% of this episode, and then you add that race that they had, and I'm just going to say this very quickly because I do not want to harp on it because I know the internet's full of this, but they picked the most physically unfit person to win this race. And my suspension of disbelief was completely broken. I didn't necessarily want Michael Burnham to win the day yet again, but at least she looks like she could have won a race with somebody. And I'm just going to leave it there because I know they're baiting us to try to get into the details of that because they purposely picked this character, Tilly, to be this person so we would make comments like that. Yes, I know in season 1 she had her disco shirt on and she was jogging around the Discovery, but this is season 5 now, and we know the condition that Tilly is in right now physically. There is no way, even under the best of conditions, she would have completed that race, and especially with that stuff that was making them thirsty as they were running. There was no way somebody in that physical shape would have completed that race. Not only completed it, but she won the race.
I'd also like to say that in the episode, they actually show the actress doing some running. Okay, so Molly learned how to bake bread during the pandemic. And Molly ate a lot of bread during the pandemic. And I can tell you right now that I can't imagine being Tilly's size and having to run on set like that, even for probably what amounted to a small amount of time for the camera. That must have been excruciating for the actress. I mean, that must have been horrible. Because not only is it physically taxing because you're carrying around a lot of weight that your body doesn't want to. So that's hard enough. But then it probably was pretty embarrassing because she probably would start to sweat, and it can be very embarrassing when things like that happen for a woman. So I can just imagine the shame she must have been feeling when they put her in that situation. And it makes me really wonder, do the showrunners and these writers, do they hate her? Mary Wiseman. Like, what they're doing to her, that really made me angry.
I think this is feeding into the pop culture thing right now of body positivity. And by the way, I happen to believe you should be proud of who you are and not be ashamed of pieces of you that you don't like. I'm completely in favor of that. But at the same time, promoting unhealthy body types that are going to shorten your lifespan, I don't know why that's happening in pop culture now, but it is. And I think they're using the Tilly character, Mary Wiseman, to promote those things, because I think they baited people to say stuff that we're talking about right now about this character, because they want to claim we're fat shaming the character and the actress, and that's not what we're trying to do at all. We're trying to point out that writers put this character in this position all because of body positivity pop culture. And I don't know why we are expected to just go around that topic and not talk about it.
Yeah. So that's really all I wanted to say about that, was that it just feels really cruel to me what those writers and the showrunners are doing to her.
And going back to the TNG episode, Who Watches the Watchers, there were just so many similarities. In that episode, when they went down to the planet, Riker and Troy, they had those subcutaneous communicators. And in Discovery, they had these, retinal tricorders.
They had two things. They had the subcutaneous communicators, but then Adira apparently, she did some sort of mod on some sort of retinal tricorders, so they had those as well.
I don't think it's just us speculating. They clearly borrowed a lot of ideas from Who Watches the Watchers. And as I said, the childhood's end from Stargate Atlantis, I think that's the other missing piece that they melded together in this.
Well, and that sacrificing people to the gods to make it rain or whatever, that's old. That's real old. I think every culture has ancient stories like that.
Yeah, but the way it was done with the rest of the story just felt a lot like that Stargate Atlantis episode, that failed piece of technology. It was the technology that brought the rain in, or it's the technology that kept the wraith away, and the technology failed, but these people associated the sacrifices with doing what the technology was actually doing behind the scenes.
Yes.
That's why I don't think it's just common trope. Yes, I agree. The concept of throwing yourself into a volcano to hope something good happens, I get that. That is common trope. But this was really specific. That's why I really think it was from that Stargate Atlantis episode.
It certainly appears very similar to that, yeah.
And then you add them in that forest, and the treehouse village in Stargate Atlantis with those kids felt more like an actual culture than in Discovery, when you had this pilgrimage of people. Was the production just so cheap they couldn't show a village and structures? But I didn't feel like this group of people in Discovery were a culture at all. It just felt like a bunch of nomadic people in the forest. And I had trouble connecting with those people as people, because they didn't have any structures. And even then, even if they did have structures that we would have seen, it was filmed so dark. Even when it was daylight, it was only slightly brighter than the nighttime scenes. So it was nearly impossible to get a good look at what was going on, and I think that was on purpose.
I think that's because they ran out of money. Why else are you using actual legal pads of yellow real paper to make your lists instead of handing somebody a computer pad? Anything? Nobody had like an iPad there on set that they could have put the list on and been like, here you go. Nope, they had that yellow piece of paper that they physically crossed off the names. I mean, that was weird.
Well, you speculated afterwards, as you were trying to figure that out, you said, is this guy a time traveler? Again, much like the Dr. Culber mushroom clone identity, I think that would make a better story. So my guess is that's not what they're doing here. But the concept of, is this guy a time traveler? That's why he had that yellow notepad.
Well, that was over 1,000 years old. How else does he have a yellow legal pad that is still usable? Because, again, you've got the paper, it's like glued up into the cardboard. It's like you could just go to the store and buy one now. How do you think that thing is going to survive 1,000 years?
No, I don't think it would have.
Exactly. So how did he get it? I know I'm trying to make logical sense of Star Trek Discovery, God help me. But he would have to be some sort of time traveler to have obtained this yellow pad. Not to mention, if you're using it, like, you must have a supply. Because why else would you take something that's over 1,000 years old and just write on it and use it as a disposable list?
And that's another thing. So this white area that they introduced in episode 1 of this season, when Dr. Glasses gave Michael Burnham that infinity charm. So what I made the assumption that was kind of like a Unimatrix Zero from Voyager, where they were connecting neurologically through some sort of network into some virtual place. But when Michael Burnham, I'm assuming, when her transport beam, because she was too lazy to walk to the bridge, so she double tapped her badge, and I assume that Dr. Glasses intercepted that and brought her to this white realm. And the reason I'm saying it's a white realm is she brought back that piece of paper. So it's not just this Unimatrix Zero type setup. This was a physical place that they were, and this place is just white. It, like, what is that supposed to be? I mean, I thought it was like the construct in the Matrix, where it was just this place that they didn't define any background, because why would you, when you're more interested in the foreground training that was done in the Matrix? So that sort of white background I was fine with. But this, you're actually physically transporting people to this area that's just full of white nothing. How? Why? I was open to the idea that maybe it was just some sort of Unimatrix Zero that they were going to meet up in, but no, she's bringing back physical objects from this place, so she was actually there.
I told you, it's like in Doom Patrol with Mr. Nobody in his little white realm, or Daffy Duck is about to come out and start screaming about a slop artist.
Yeah. Because the episode on the planet, exploring a new world, and they were trying to do Star Trek stuff, so I'm going to try to give them a little bit of credit that at least they did that, because they figured out, hey, finally, let's make a Star Trek-like episode. But then they stole stuff from 2 other properties. I have trouble giving them credit for making a Star Trek story because they didn't originally do it. They just rehashed a TNG and Stargate Atlantis episode.
It's so weird because they can't be doing this on their own. There has to be some sort of farming using AI to create the original concept for the story, and then I think they must hand it to these writers and say, here, flesh this out.
Picard Season 3 was Ronald D. Moore's Battlestar Galactica. For those of you new to the channel that didn't hear us talk about that in Season 3, Season 3 of Picard, it had a few other pieces, but at the end there, it was ripping off at least the mini-series of Battlestar Galactica, Ronald D. Moore from the early 2000s. So I think they've been doing this sort of farming for a while, at least a couple of years.
Most of what I've been watching recently, and obviously it's been a lot of new Trek, but with a lot of this, you can go back, and if you have watched a lot of science fiction from the past, then it's very easy to sit there and just say, wow, I see elements of this episode and this episode of these other 2 franchises, and I think they combine them to create this. Even with Season 3 of Picard, knowing that Terry Matalas was a huge fan of Back to the Future, that one episode, I don't even remember, I think it was like Season 3, Episode 4, maybe. That's the one where they had to harness the energy from the contraction out of the nebula. That just reminded me so much of having to harness the lightning bolt to get Marty McFly back to 1985.
1.21 gigawatts.
Yeah, exactly. But in the case with Terry Matalas, you can see the influence of other franchises that he is known to like. Do these people have any original ideas of their own, or are they just doing mashups of either something a computer spits out at them that other people have done before, or just some other franchise that they like that other people have done before.
There's a difference between homage and just mashing stuff up. Because if you listen to some of the early CGI artists from Babylon 5, they'll mention that there were some shots from Battlestar Galactica, the 1970s Battlestar Galactica, that they liked, that they reproduced in Babylon 5, at least the early seasons. But that was homage. They weren't trying to sell anything as their own. It wasn't a major story point. It was just a couple of specifically visual effects scenes. If anybody's watched 70s Battlestar Galactica knows they recycled shots over and over again for their space battles. And this was just paying homage to that in some of the scenes that they had in early Babylon 5.
Yeah, because the story of Babylon 5 had nothing to do with the story from Battlestar Galactica.
So there's a difference between homage, I was really influenced by something and I want to pay respect to it, and then there's just ripping it off. Because I think that Terry Matalas was a fan of Ronald D. Moore's. So, one little thing here or there in Picard would have been fine, but when he ripped off the story from the miniseries that started the Battlestar Galactica early 2000s, that's not homage anymore. That's stealing. If you're going to steal something or you're going to be influenced, you should give textual credit. Because that episode of Strange New Worlds, the Ursula Le Guin one, if they would have just given credit that said based on a short story by Ursula Le Guin, I think we would have been fine with that episode.
Yeah, but you can't do that because then you'll have to pay money.
Well, and I would think these people in Hollywood would realize artists should be rewarded for their work.
Yeah.
I think what they're doing now, it's like that Father Ted episode when they were going to Eurovision and they thought they picked a melody that nobody ever heard of, and so they stole the melody and they were going to put their own lyrics in there and call it their own. If they think that Battlestar Galactica, Stargate Atlantis, The Next Generation, heck, Deep Space Nine, if they think that that's stuff that Trekkies won't pick up on, they're sadly mistaken. So that's why I don't think they're doing it on purpose.
Well, they crossed the line between member berries and just outright plagiarism.
Toward the end of the Picard run and this run and Strange New Worlds, the finale of this season was an Alien ripoff. Their AI outline they got, because we made a video talking about this, because I don't think anybody, even what's in Hollywood now, can be this incompetent. It has to be AI is generating an outline for them, and then they're giving it to writers to flesh out the details. Because when you and I played around, well, specifically when Molly played around with ChatGPT to write Star Trek stories, and that was ChatGPT, a very generic, mainstream-facing AI, not specific to writing. And it did a reasonably good job of giving you a beginning of an outline for a story. Because you did, I think, 3 or 4 in that video.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine the AI they must have specifically for Hollywood writers to be using. And it's got to be a lot more sophisticated than what ChatGPT is doing for writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't even think anymore it's a speculation thing. I think it is proven as closely as we can without having a recording of somebody talking about this that they are stealing AI scripts and then fleshing them out. And I don't think it's just limited to Star Trek, by the way.
Well, I know one of the contentious things about the contract for the writers was the use of AI. And at first I thought, oh, good, these writers, they don't want AI replacing them. But then I looked into it, and it turned out what the real bone of contention was, the writers wanted to maintain writing credit even when AI was used. That's a big difference from what I thought it actually was. And again, that tells me that they're in all likelihood using AI already. I know some people are saying, oh, it's just to generate story ideas. Well, yeah, but they're still generating story ideas based on scraping other people's ideas that are available in the database or on the internet or wherever they're getting it from. These are already published works from somebody else. No, you shouldn't get writing credit for that. You should tell your AI to tell you where they stole it from, and those people should get writing credit.
because that's what we're dealing with now. If you're a young person, so if you're listening to this and you're like in your 20s, maybe early 30s, and if you're not really familiar with a large body of work when it comes to past television shows like Galactica, Star Wars, Star Trek, Babylon 5, Stargate Atlantis, if you're not familiar with those works and you see something that you think is new on the screen and you're like, man, this is good stuff, I almost feel bad. It's kind of like a magician taking away your joy by explaining how he did the trick. Go back and watch Season 3, Episode 4, Who Watches the Watchers of the Next Generation of Star Trek. And then if you have a chance, go and watch Season 1, Episode 6 of Stargate Atlantis, Childhood's End. And much like we said with Strange New World, that Lost in Translation episode that, in my opinion, ripped off Doctor Who's 42. And once you see that, I mean, I don't know, maybe young people are fine with plagiarism. They don't see a difference between paying homage and just outright plagiarizing. Maybe when we try to explain how this is wrong, maybe that's not a thing for them. Maybe intellectual honesty, maybe that's not a thing. Academic honesty, maybe that's just not a thing. Literary honesty, that's just not something they follow. Maybe it's just us being so old that we can't connect with that younger generation that thinks plagiarizing is okay. Because it might just be a difference in ethics here, where you and I were brought up in the idea of, I mean, it got so bad that we had to learn different formats to cite our work when we wrote papers at university. And that's how meticulous they made us document the stuff that we got from other places.
From what I understand now, when they submit papers, that it has to go through a plagiarism check first through software. So this shouldn't be that they're okay with plagiarism, because they'll get nailed for that if they do that themselves. I have to wonder if this is just their own, I hate to use the word ignorance, but it is. They just aren't aware of these other properties. They haven't seen these other shows.
Then why are they writing for a science fiction show in 2024?
Well, because again, this is the job they got. For instance, oh God, one of our commenters, thank you so much for doing this, they posted that there had been an interview with Carlos Cisco, one of the writers on the previous episode. And we listened to this interview with this writer. He did not know anything about Star Trek before he started writing for Star Trek. He fell into this.
And he said he went like on a weekend binge of watching, I guess, all the episodes. I don't know how you can do that in like a weekend.
You can't. It's not enough time, so I wonder what he really watched. I think he said Deep Space Nine was his favorite, so maybe that's all he watched was DS9.
And maybe it was longer than a weekend, but there's so much material there. You would have to spend minimum of 1 year watching the material to get through it in a way that's not on fast forward, sticking it on 1.5x speed and hoping that you caught most of it.
But this guy, who was not actually familiar with Star Trek at all, he became the resident expert in that writing room. So it doesn't surprise me any that this person who really didn't understand the franchise, wasn't familiar with it, that he also wouldn't be familiar with other properties. He even admitted in the interview that he didn't watch TV in the 90s.
If you're going to write for a science fiction show, in my opinion, you need to be well-versed in the genre. Now, you could say, well, what does that mean, books? Well, in 2024, that doesn't hurt, but I really think you need to be familiar at least with the big science fiction franchises over the past 50 years. Because you're going to be drawing on that culture as you build your thing, hopefully on top of it, because you're stepping on the shoulders of giants, as they say.
Blade Runner, do androids dream of electric sheep? That's what that was based on. Oh gosh, Johnny Mnemonic was based on Neuromancer. That was actually a novel. And also, it wouldn't necessarily even be books, because a lot of science fiction, when it became popularized in we'll just say like around the 1970s. It was really popular then, the 60s and 70s. And a lot of it was based on short stories, oftentimes appearing in magazines. You see things like The Terminator, which, was it James Cameron got sued by...
Yeah, Harlan Ellison. There were 2 Outer Limits episodes, The Demon with the Glass Hand and Soldier, that when you watch those episodes, you can see... or at least the basic framework of the Terminator was set up in those 2 episodes. So I know a lot of people say they paid Ellison hush money to be quiet because some people say Ellison would accuse everybody of stealing stuff one time or another. But when you watch Demon with the Glass Hand and Soldier and you know you're pointing toward Terminator, I think he had a case there. And I'm glad he at least got a credit. I think in the videotape release, that was the settlement.
Yeah. And obviously, if you're into science fiction, then you know the name Harlan Ellison. Ursula Le Guin, it was short stories that she wrote, which again, they stole from her in Strange New Worlds. And also, they stole from her in Discovery, too. That screaming Kelpian, that was definitely stolen from her. Even if it was never credited, I don't care. I could see it.
The one that caused the burn?
Yes. It was very obvious. It's not even just a matter of having to read books. You could just go back and read a lot of the short stories or even watch old Outer Limits or old...
Twilight Zone.
Yeah, Twilight Zone. There's a lot to be learned from watching this stuff because that really formed the basis of a lot of what we watch now. So you really have to know the origins, the building blocks, what the basis was, the foundation. I think that when you have these writers who don't have that experience, all they're doing is drawing off of the soap opera writing that we have today, and then they pair that with their very surface level knowledge of the franchise. That's when you get the crap that we're being stuck with.
These writers, I would argue, they would say that they have experience watching stuff like Twilight Zone, but it was called Black Mirror.
Ugh.
And yeah, I mean, you and I have the same opinion. I think there were a couple of good Black Mirror episodes, but overall, I didn't care for that series at all. The original Twilight Zone was so much better than Black Mirror, but I've talked to people who've watched Black Mirror, and I've said, hey, did you watch the Twilight Zone? Nope.
Yeah.
Or if they did, it was like briefly, like I think they had like a rejuvenation of it a few years ago.
Oh God, I'd forgotten all about that.
So they would be calling back to that. It's like, no. We're talking like 60 years ago.
Not the movie, the original series. Yeah.
But, Black Mirror and whatever. There are several things that I think you need to go back and watch if you're going to make something in pop culture. The black and white Outer Limits, the black and white Twilight Zone, TOS, Space 1999. I could list a bunch of these going through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even 2000s that you have to go through and watch those if you're going to write science fiction television. Now, if you're going to make a motion picture and it's quote-unquote art, then maybe that's not so necessary. But if you're going to make television, there are those things you have to watch so that you have that in your back pocket, so that you're building on those things, not just stealing from them because some AI program connected part of a story idea with one of those franchises.
And I was lucky because when I was a kid, my dad used to bring home videotapes from the video store, which obviously nobody's doing that anymore. But the point is that he brought home things like Metropolis, the original Metropolis, the silent film, and Zardoz, and A Boy and His Dog, all sorts of different, really, I guess what would be considered to be obscure things at this point in the science fiction genre. So I was exposed to a lot of that stuff at a very early age. I don't understand how these people who've never watched any of these things go out there and think that they can write interesting science fiction for actual science fiction fans, which comes back around to, I don't think this actually is getting written for science fiction fans.
No, it's...
Like I said, it's in the beginning of this episode, in the recap, and I said, tell me you're writing this to pander to Gen Z without telling me you're writing this to pander to Gen Z. And that was that list of all these attributes that this species that they were going to interact with had, with their multiple genders and their interconnectedness, and it was a data dump. And honestly, I would be embarrassed if I'd written that.
again, I've said this all season. What they're writing with these connections, and I need a purpose bigger than myself, it's not the normal ideas of people wanting to find out something more than just existence. Because, that's basically what V'ger was trying to do in the motion picture of Star Trek. What this is the type of stuff that cults use to recruit members in saying, hey, does life confuse you? Are you looking for more meaning than what you have? Hey, look, we got Michael Burnham here. Michael Burnham will give your life purpose.
It's brainwash and manipulate.
Every episode's reinforcing this connections thing. If other people were making this and trying to press that lesson, I might be open-minded to it. But what these current writers are doing, they are doing nothing more than pushing propaganda for a cult.
Like you said, it would be more interesting if Dr. Culber, after all this time, realized he was being called back to the mushroom patch. Because, again, they seem to think this mushroom patch is this, I guess, universe-wide thing that is all interconnected and you can just travel through it, whatever. But that would be far more interesting if his spores were calling him home than I have a feeling what they're actually going to do here.
You and I just sitting around watching television in the living room are coming up with, I think, better ideas than what they're going to do.
Well, because again, you and I have an extensive history of watching and reading science fiction, and I just don't think that these writers have that same depth of knowledge.
So for me, how am I going to review this episode? It was a decent ripoff of TNG and Stargate Atlantis because it was watchable. There was stuff in here that almost felt like Star Trek. So I think this probably was the best of the season. Honestly, possibly the best of the whole series. But it was stolen material. So I can't recommend it because I know where it was stolen from, or at least where it feels strongly it was stolen from. But if you're not familiar with what I'm mentioning, and you watch this, you might like this episode. It had a Star Trek spin to it.
I don't disagree with anything you just said. However, for me, the two warring narratives, the themes that they had, one being this spiritual connection to something bigger than yourself, but then at the same time, stop sacrificing yourself to gods that were actually alien technology. I just felt like those two ideas were at odds with each other and just were having a fight throughout this episode. Yeah, if you can look past that and just take each for what it is, then I think that at least with their alien technology down on the planet, the stolen story that was a mashup of that Stargate Atlantis episode and the TNG episode, that, like you said, was the most Trek-like that we've gotten out of Star Trek Discovery this season, definitely, and like you said, possibly the whole series. Then there's one last thing I want to say here. I don't know if you noticed, but when Tilly and Michael Burnham were talking about Starfleet Academy, and Tilly was telling Michael Burnham that they could really use someone like her, it made me wonder. So this Starfleet Academy show, is Sonequa Martin Green going to be in it as Michael Burnham teaching at Starfleet Academy with Tilly?
And what is Tilly teaching?
I have no idea.
But yeah,
Well, and again, if Michael Burnham is teaching ancient xenoanthropology, then, I guess maybe there is a place for her there. Probably better suited to her than captaining a starship
where people's lives are
1,000 years out of time. Mm-hmm. At least if she's teaching ancient history, at least that would make sense. So, who knows? Maybe they could write that better, but I doubt it. Because then you really have to start getting into the lore. And what a disaster.
They need to stop this secret hideout continuity.
Yeah.
It's garbage. It's a dead end. I honestly don't know why people watch this other than they somehow feel that any Star Trek is good Star Trek and they want to feel... Heck, maybe it's that connection thing. They want to feel like they're part of something bigger, so they're latching on to this franchise because that's the something bigger. That's the community they want to be part of. Yet when others of us try to say how a lot of what they're pushing in the secret hideout stuff is incompatible with what we've followed before, our quote-unquote religion as Trekkies. They just get mad at us and just tell us to shut up and go away.
Well, that's why they get so angry, because we're threatening that connection that they feel.
It didn't have to go down like this.
No, it didn't.
You could have made a Trek series for the late teens, 2020s that still fit in with proper Star Trek. I mean, you could have done that so that everybody is getting along with their own Star Trek, but we all acknowledge we're part of a larger franchise. That's the connections we would be going with. Then maybe this messaging at the end that they're doing would make some sense in narrative, but it doesn't. The meta story here is that Secret Hideout is this offshoot of actual Star Trek, and it's going to be forgotten once Secret Hideout no longer is making these things, because it is incompatible with TOS, TNG, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and I hate to say it, even Enterprise. It is incompatible with those series. So it has to go off in its own little area. What they're making is some what-if universe, because there's no way this fits in. And once they're done making this stuff and pop culture can no longer protect it as new and flashy, this is going to go away. It's going to be in some bargain bin somewhere at the dollar store or something as a curiosity. It's going to be like the Star Wars Christmas special, where to me that was more Star Wars than this is Star Trek, and that wasn't very good.
Yeah. No, it's going to end up like those E.T. game cartridges buried in a hole in the desert.
In a landfill and just...
Yep, exactly. So, anyway... We didn't even talk about the Prime Directive or anything like that, but didn't seem worth talking about.
TNG, Who Watches the Watchers? They had a really good discussion about the Prime Directive.
Yeah.
Go watch that. It's basically the same thing as this.
Except done right. So anyway, obviously, yes, please talk about that and more in the comments below, because obviously this has gotten a lot longer than we intended, which usually happens because there's a lot to unpack about this crap.
At least it's the last season, so all of our complaining, this is it for Discovery, so at least we won't have to do any more Discovery complaining after this season is over.
Unless, of course, Michael Burnham goes with Tilly to Starfleet Academy and they actually make that crap.
Well, that's a whole new series. We'll be able to have all sorts of new complaints about that one.
Yes, but it'll have the origins in this because we actually know its history.
Well, she'll be able to teach how she had an intrinsic understanding of Klingon culture.
Oh, God. All right. On that note, thank you, everyone, for listening. Again, comments below. Until next week.
Take care.